computer. I'm going to do that. Good day, everyone. My name is Rob Schwer. I'm the executive director of the Give Back Yoga Foundation, guest co-creator of Give Back Yoga University, which was launched in November to serve as a virtual online platform for people who are interested in this intersection between yoga, yoga therapy, yoga service, and nonprofit work. And I couldn't be happier to sort of have on this program, which is a set of free interviews for people who are interested in getting to know the leaders in the yoga service movement than having Lynn Fitton here. Mary Lynn and I go back at least a decade to when the Yoga Service Council was founded. She's been someone who since 2005 is bringing yoga to trauma-informed yoga to young girls who are at this precipice between being a teenager, getting into trouble, and ending up in the prison system and the prison pipeline or not. And she's really been someone who's worked and had a huge impact on thousands of young girls to keep them out of prison. She is a nurse practitioner. She's a Child Trauma Academy trainer. She's one of the co-founders of the Yoga Service Council. Oh my, she's been featured in the Washington Post, NPR, Huffington Post, lots of other places. Mary Lynn, welcome.
Thank you. It's such an honor to be here. It's really good to see you. Thank you for having me.
You know, I like to start these interviews, asking this question: how did you get into yoga? I mean, how did this start? There's kind of an arc that yoga teachers have to end up in service.
Yeah.
And what was your moment of starting? Why did you what was your first class? And what happened after that?
We're going back over 30 years ago now. So I'm a neurosurgical ICU nurse in my 20s, my early 20s. And, I think I was at a time in my life where I just never stopped moving. I was working, and then I was an athlete and would, running and doing marathons and everything, and never really stopped moving. And my older sister, Annie, said to me, flexibility is kind of important too. I think you should try yoga. And this was, so long ago, it wasn't on every corner. And I had a feeling she was wanting more for me than just the flexibility. And so I attended my first class, and it was really uncomfortable. But I knew I needed it. The uncomfortable part was the quiet. And so over time, then I certainly started practicing on my own. And I'm sure many of you can relate to this, that sort of stillness that yoga brings us to gave me a real sense of what my inner dialogue was, how I was speaking to myself. And that was really sad for me. I became cognizant of just a really rough, critical inner voice. And so over time, with just me on my mat, I was reconciling with that and slowly kind of healing some past stuff and using yoga, as we all do, to heal that. And then later I became a nurse practitioner, family nurse practitioner, and so many young women in my clinical practice that I would see would come to me with self-harm and eating disorders and anxiety and depression. And I really felt that because of my own past, that yoga could be both a remedy and a prevention for a lot of what I was seeing. So I went to my own teacher training, but first I started kind of prescribing yoga to everybody, and there weren't a lot of yoga studios at the time, so I had to really do some research and find them. Then I became a yoga teacher, and yoga was quickly becoming kind of inaccessible and elitist a little bit and expensive, and that really bothered me because I felt that prevented a lot of young women that would need yoga, that could really help them from getting it. And so I went into an area in my community that was underserved, and started working with some middle school girls there. And that was the beginning. And then from there into the juvenile system. So actually the middle school, then to residential treatment centers, and then into the prison system. So that's kind of how it all happened. It was profound for me personally. And I really wanted young women to have that same sense of kind of coming home to themselves, that peace that yoga gave me. And I wanted them to have it as early as they could.
So Mary Lynn, where was that first moment of faith? Where was it that you were either teaching in a juvenile delinquent facility or in a prison, that you had an experience of faith that this is the path that you wanted to be on?
That it was working? It was a string of moments, really. I was really passionate about, with each of my patients, when they tell me their stories, I knew it could help them. But then when we were in the juvenile system, I think there was one particular young woman who just had so much suffering in her life that I saw her, we allowed her to sort of just watch for a while and kind of just get a sense of what was happening in our circle, because she wasn't totally comfortable yet. And then over time, she started joining the practice. Then she allowed us to give her adjustments, which was a really big deal. We know that now. And then finally, we saw her, after a few months, move into leadership. And you could almost see her kind of beginning to embody her own physical self again after, as you know, many trauma survivors kind of cut off and dissociate from their body, and to kind of see that before my eyes. And it wasn't just her, it was with so many young women. So I would say that was definitely watching it in the individual youth that we were working with, and seeing that transformation gave me a lot of faith that what we were doing really was working.
So what's the mission of the Art of Yoga Project?
The mission is to affect change, behavior, to really use, I'm just going to say it in the simplest way, but to use yoga to heal trauma. So, and to help them, to help the youth use yoga as a tool for self-regulation. So as you know, their lower brain systems get very dysregulated because of their trauma, and we have to absolutely address that. If we don't address that, then they won't be able to take advantage of any other services that we're providing as a society, because if they are still in that cycle of violence and victimization, and still in the cycle of overreacting or underreacting to their environments, then they won't be able to get out of that cycle. So that's really our mission, to help them shift out of those cycles into empowerment and healing and self-determination.
But back in 2004, 2005, Mary Lynn, people weren't using the word trauma, or there was nothing called trauma-informed yoga. So how did you come up with this and instill it into the mission?
Yeah, I think it was really interesting to kind of have the realization that the trauma was there, because our curriculum in the juvenile system, it was a yoga and creative arts curriculum, still is, but we based it on the 8 limbs of yoga. So it included both discussions and creative expression. And that gave a lot of opportunity for the youth to tell us about their lives. So you couldn't avoid seeing the pain that they were through. They literally, someone created a self-portrait that's around their face that said, "Can't you see my pain and suffering?" And they wanted us to see that. And it was on us, and still is on us, to really pay attention and to listen to that. And this, I think, is a really key thing here, is to know that this was a time in the juvenile justice system where it was really shifting from, there's kind of this continuum where the juvenile justice system was very punitive and detention oriented and more of a policing model, all the way to where we want it to be, which is more of a parenting model and more of a a holistic and rehabilitative model. And this was at a time where this was just still happening. And that in the more detention oriented or punitive, they're seeing the youth as a danger to society and someone that needs to be punished as a deterrent. And we slowly, with our partners in probation and behavioral health, started to see and understand that the youth were survivors of trauma. And that's a key thing, that there was abuse and neglect and violence, domestic violence, seeing that trafficking. That was a huge part of our History at the Art of Yoga project, was seeing that part of it. And as I've discussed with you before, sort of the sexual abuse to prison pipeline that is so prevalent for girls. And to also see actually the manifestations of the trauma that would show up in our classrooms. So we had to absolutely change our approach, because why bring in yoga if they can't receive it? So as I was talking about before, if they're in a place of hyperarousal dissociation and they're not present in our space to receive our intervention, then what good is it going to be? So for instance, if we're in a class, in the old days, we would do, we would maybe read like a really heady poem and then have them check in. And we go around the circle and girl after girl would kind of say, what was the check-in? What was the question? And because they weren't there, they weren't present. And so we had to address that underlying dysregulation and change our model. And now kind of we have this mantra of like, regulate, then relate, then reason. And you absolutely have to do that before you can expect to relate to them, to have them connect with each other, to take in any psychoeducation about their own trauma, for example, which we want to get to. You absolutely have to regulate first. So that's become our model, and that evolved over time, really with our partners, and by partnering with the Child Trauma Academy to learn the neurosequential model therapeutics. That was a really big change in how we do things. And now it just works, especially during COVID, where we really are doing a lot of exciting things, but we won't go to that. That's a whole nother topic.
Well, no, I do want to touch on that, how you teach in times of COVID. Let's get back to that. But let me read something from one of your participants. Before
really?
I participated in the yoga program, I didn't care about my life. I just wanted to have fun and do what I wanted, not listen to anybody. It made me realize I'm 15 and I'm doing all this stuff and I could end up dying from it. It showed me how to care about my life. That really touches me, and I'm curious as to how you hit on this idea of including the expressive part, this sort of right brain, left brain aspect to all of this, and incorporate that as a systematic part of your offering.
Well, it was always really important to me. Reflective writing was always a part of my own process and still is. So from the beginning, I wanted to pair yoga and art. It's a really natural pairing. Yoga brings it up. It connects us with our deep unconscious, our creative, right? And we also, as you know about trauma, if we're saying, hey, get in there and feel what's happening in your body, it can be terrifying because they work really hard to cut that off, to not feel. So we have to do it in a really safe way. And if we're going to be bringing it up for them, we have to give them a vehicle to process it also. And sometimes I've heard youth say, I really didn't have the words, but I could do it. I could use it. I could use my artwork to process and get it out. So giving them that voice. And then in the long term, giving them an alternative to self-destructive behavior so they can paint and write and draw instead of self-harm or addictive behaviors. So journaling is like a really big part of their practice, along with breathing techniques, doing prompts like writing, hot pen. And then really seeing that the art, this really moves me because you can see that it then becomes a part of their identity, and where they had an identity of being what someone told them they were, of troubled, a problem, even victim, not so good, delinquent, they can then have a new identity of painter, writer, sculptor, artist. These core identities that they have. I mean, I remember once I was talking about goodness, and this girl looked at me and said, "No, I'm bad." It had been so internalized that that's who she was. And so to be able to give them opportunities to have a new identity is really powerful, and art does that. It's also, this is the other key piece of it that we've come to learn too, which is sort of obvious, but it's very sensory. You know, we're doing a ton with ceramics and clay, and the sensory integration really addresses those lower brain centers that need healing from early trauma.
So run us through a typical class, and how long is it? What are the yoga aspects and the expressive aspects that are touched upon? Or what does it look like?
A typical class, I would say especially in time of COVID, there aren't as many typical classes, but generally speaking, we have a whole methodology. And so a typical class there's a lot of behind the scenes things of finding out who's going to be there, what's their environment, getting all the supplies we need, talking to each other, what's going on with the youth, talking to the facility, what's going on with the youth. All that has to be done before prep, big time. Coming in, setting up the mats. I'm going to talk about what it looks like when we're in person. Setting up the mats in a circle to mitigate power differential. And sometimes placing people, like maybe a youth is in an opposite gang, and so you don't want them to really be within vision with each other. So we're really intentional about how to set up our classes for success that way. So setting up the circle, then we'll, before we do anything else, self-regulating, sensory integrating warm-up, getting them breathing and moving, because they are not in that room yet. So doing that, we have a whole catalog that we've developed. We call them NMT warm-ups from the neurosequential model of therapeutics. Then we will talk about our theme really briefly. We try not to do much didactic, just to first to have them moving or breathing whenever we're doing any kind of teaching, because we think that's important, or doing art. So introducing the theme, using a sensory item to pass around and have them do a check-in. And the check-in is important because it's saying, you know, you're here, we see you, and to really have everybody kind of enter and be in the room. So doing their check-in, and it can be, and we keep it kind of simpler than later, because they're getting more and more regulated through the class, ideally. And so a simple check-in, we really like to do how you're feeling, so that they can, at the end of class, then they can see and recognize how they're feeling at the end. But it could be anything based on the theme. And then we move into asana, pretty simple asana practice. Slow but dynamic, keeping them moving, not too long of holds, very moderate, predictable, controlled. All these trauma-informed principles, which is a whole nother session to talk about all the things we've learned and how to be trauma-informed, invitational language. And then they might, then during the asana, we're weaving in the themes, then they're doing, in their savasana, we might be going around setting up all the art materials. And then in the guided meditation, which is always very body-based, we're not taking them out of their bodies, very sensory body-based. They're then brought into maybe a prompt, and then move into an art exercise. They could then do a share about their art or their writing, or we might do, especially if there's a lot of dysregulation, we might just do a silent gallery walk to see each other's work, or a checkout, and then a checkout, which could be a little bit more powerful and a little bit deeper, and then the share about that. So that's kind of in it, like our format, that depending on how much time we have, we do different amounts of that. Sometimes we have whole classes where there's a little bit of movement and a lot longer art, you know, like a whole class of self-portraiture or something like that.
That's something I was going to ask. Is this a 60-minute class or a 90-minute class, or a
depends on the setting? Workshop? Yeah, they're not really workshops. They're, you know, we have everything from right now during COVID, 15 minutes of regulation at the beginning of an ethnic studies class for all the freshmen in one gang impacted high school in San Jose, to an hour and a half workshops at the Restorative Justice Institute in Oakland. It's called Our Joy. I'm not getting their name exactly right. Restorative Justice for Oakland Youth. And so there's a variation in the juvenile facilities. They're about 50 minutes roughly. You know, we're integrated. We think it's best to be integrated into the school day because there's that validity of our work. Mm-hmm. So then we go on the school schedule. Sometimes we're kind of a PE replacement, and so we have to get enough physical movement then in terms of the requirements. Is that making sense? It depends. We kind of have to be bespoke and really customized to what our partners are needing us to do. Sometimes there's a facility where in some of our detention facilities, the youth are not out of their cells very much. And so they really love to interact, and the discussion is really important. In another facility, there's a lot of wraparound services, and they get a lot of much more behavioral health services, and they're kind of tired of talking about their stuff. And so we get in, we regulate them, and there's a lot of play too. We play yoga, Jenga. We games are really big. We want to bring in joy and light to the youth too, and so that's a lot of fun.
It's a mantra I hear all the time in the yoga world. It depends. It depends. And
it depends. Oh, it does. Well, it has to, because we have to be flexible and respond to what's in front of us, right?
Take us back to when you first tried to get into a facility, or any one of those, or a school. I mean, yeah. I'm a new yoga teacher. I want to. This work really interests me, hypothetically, and I think you're doing amazing work. Of course you are. I know that, but I'm a little concerned. I'm fearful of going to a principal and offering this. I mean, what was it like? How did you start this?
Yeah, okay. So again, it depends. I think the most important thing for you as someone who wants to sell and market what you want to do is to figure out what they care about the most. In schools, we're going to talk about all truths, but really framing our impact depending on who we're talking with. If we're talking to educators, it's about how they're much more engaged and their concentration and focus level is better. If it's the juvenile system, they become more accountable. And self-regulation is sort of a theme that works almost for everyone. So that's been really the key thing, to really impress upon everyone that they're going to be just better in their lives if they can handle their emotions better. And yoga is sort of this lab where we learn to do that in, again, a moderate, controlled, predictable way, that we, in that kind of environment, that we create little bits of stress, so that they can then learn to handle those in our classroom, so that they can handle them out in their lives. So so it really depends on who we're talking to. I got really, really lucky, and I'll just say this, and James Fox and I have talked about this a lot before, because he works with adults, and he would just say, they let you do what? Like, it would blow his mind how much we benefited from working with girls and working in the juvenile system, because there's just different attitudes, generally speaking. I mean, I'm not saying it wasn't hard, because there were a lot of barriers. You get in, maybe we were working with a very progressive judge who, they were at the time, way back in 2005, they were seeing that girls were the fastest growing segment of the juvenile system. And instead of really understanding the pathways for girls into the system, they were saying, oh, well, we'll have cooking then, and we'll put them in pink sweatshirts, and that we'll call that gender responsive for girls. But that's not what they needed to be doing. And this judge really got that. And so we were learning alongside of all of these professionals how to have this place called Camp Kemp for girls in one of the counties here in California. And that was a really progressive place, and is still, and we're still there. And so they invited us to come in because they knew we were all about, working with young women. We have since, I just need to mention this, we've since become much more gender expansive, and we work with male identified youth and certainly with gender nonconforming non-binary youth. But we've started working with boys too. The boys units were saying, how come the girls get yoga? Literally, we were asked to come and work with the boys, and they love the art too. I'm just gonna say it. It's pretty powerful and really exciting. And we have these amazing male teachers that play music with them, and they sing as part of that self-regulation. It's very special. So just wanted to let you know we're also working with boys too.
Yeah, I'm so glad you've broadened and scaled as well. That's phenomenal.
And I think I just want to go back to your question, because I think that this is an environment now, definitely in California, where there is much more of an opening, more of a receptivity than there used to be about this, about yoga in prison. What? It's a thing now, right? We have best practices for yoga in the criminal justice system, and I can bring that book with me. So to bring best practices for yoga in schools, bring that book, buy that book from the Yoga Service Council and bring it with you if you're going to try to go and work in whatever setting you are. Bring that legitimate, that kind of saying, it's a thing. Look, here's a book and here's a way to do it. Don't just get any yoga teacher to come in and do it. We have to be well trained to do this.
Yeah, so the name of the book is Best Practices for Yoga in the Criminal Justice System. You were one of the co-writers of that. It's available from the Yoga Service.
I'm a contributing editor, yeah. Yes.
Yep. And one of the things that is touched upon, I remember reading this book, is touch and adjustment. And you mentioned that. And so you're going into facilities where the girls mostly have been victims of sexual abuse.
Yep.
And you're using touch and adjustment.
Yeah.
How are you doing that? And how are you doing it in ways that are safe and predictable to the people you're working with?
Thank you for asking that. I know that a lot of trauma-informed yoga advocates for no touch at all, and I do respect that. However, because of my training with Child Trauma Academy, I know that touch done in the right way, impeccably, intentionally, can be, that sensory element can be so healing on both a lower brain level of sensory integration, but also in terms of attachment, which is another big area where youth that have had trauma, they have attachment issues. So seeing what a healthy relationship can look like is another big intervention that we're doing, teaching them that. How do we do it? We have a whole adjustment protocol, and we train our staff it's really, really important. We advocate, and I would just say this in general, in terms of the yoga community as a whole, please use those adjustment cards. Because we've been around for 15 years. We went from having the youth put their heads down in child's pose and saying, raise your hand if you don't want to be touched. Not enough. They might not be paying attention. They might be embarrassed to say it. They might change throughout the class on whether they want it or not. A memory might come up and then they're like, no. So have to have the card, give them that autonomy. We have them we have an art class where they make their own make their own cards. So they can write hella yeah and no way on the back or whatever in their own words. And that's one of our classes on boundaries. And so we use art in that way. They make their own cards. Always, even with the cards, asking when you approach, making your presence known, making some noise when you come over. Consider timing, really not at the beginning of class. Remember, the sequencing of the neurosequential model is really, they get technically more and more regulated. So you're not going to start off a class by touching somebody or even asking to touch someone. You should be really known to the student. The sub is not the one who should be touching people, in my point of view. And then, of course, all the yoga teachers, we all need to make sure our touch is purposeful, non-sexual, empowering, and giving them a sense of control, like push into my hand here instead of having something done to them. So that's kind of, wrapping it up in our key points, but there's a lot more to it. And we have we literally demonstrate, here's what to do, here's what not to do in our trainings, and a really simple, pretty quick adjustment. And that's from years of making mistakes with it, honestly, not knowing about particularly sexual trauma. You know, people push the shoulders down. Can't do that with someone who's had sexual trauma. You don't want to be doing that. You don't want to be over somebody. So where your positioning is really important too, where you're putting your own body.
Yeah, it's a subject, you know, that we could spend a lot of time on.
I know. There's so much to talk about.
It's really an important one, but you know, you talked about the impact and the curriculum, and that this is 15 years old now.
Yeah.
When did you decide to start collecting data on what you're doing, and what exactly are you presenting to the authorities in the schools or in the state of California?
Yeah. We started doing assessments pretty early on because it's actually because of the more general knowledge of the effects of the positive effects of somatic practices. We're not asked so much anymore to bring hard research. We are asked to show evaluation, so more aggregates of our core outcomes, which we decided early on by talking to a lot of professionals and the youth themselves, because that's key to center youth and their voice. So what's important, what matters, what do we want to have as an outcome? So our three things are self-awareness, self-worth or self-respect, and then self-control, or now we say self-regulation. So we use standardized measurements, and for 10 years, we've always, I mean, really rarely when we don't get over 80% in those measures. So so that's kind of where we are with that. And of course, I would love to do more of a controlled study. We're talking to Stanford Psychiatry right now about doing something more formal, but that would really be about cortisol levels or MRIs. I mean, to really have the hard science as a scientist myself. But then there's also the thing about the ethics around having a control group when you know your intervention works. So I have a lot of trouble with that. So that's always been a thing for me. And we're much more of a direct service organization than we are a research organization. Yeah. We've relied on our partners that have been doing research to bring in the data a little bit more than we've been doing that ourselves.
And the assessment tools are used for every class, and who aggregates that data over time? I mean,
we partner with a third party. San Jose State University was doing that. You know, that's our partner that designed the instruments, sending in their own interns so that we could be as objective as possible.
So share some of the quantitative data.
Increases in self-awareness, self-respect, and statistically increases in those three areas, I think, is the main thing. That's more of our quantitative data.
So,
and then we had another study with our mentoring, and I don't have that information right in front of me, but we showed improvements in their relationships with family members, with themselves, with even their probation officers. We did a study in mentoring, in our mentoring program back, I don't know, 2010, I think.
And is there data on how you're breaking the pipeline of ending up in prison for these young girls?
I wish I could say that we have hard data about reducing recidivism, but that would require the counties to be tracking that data themselves, and it's just not there. So that's just the reality. And it's because for the juvenile justice system, it is very murky on what is a new offense. As you know, there's been, or maybe you don't know, there's so much more, there's been so much reform about what constitutes an offense. So there's things called status offenses, which are offensive for youth, but not for adults, like running away from home, or talking to their boyfriend when they were on a non-association order, or using their phone when they're not supposed to. These are not crimes, and we would criminalize them, and they would end up back in the system. Their grades would go down, and it's a cycle. So these are things that you don't really want to be measuring new offenses when they're not really offenses. They are understandable things that are happening to youth that are in trauma, and we have been criminalizing them. And we need to now, and we're working as an organization and at the table, working to decarcerate and decriminalize youth. And it's happening, and I'm really proud of that, and it's so exciting.
Yeah, California is definitely ahead of the pack in that regard because of the severity of the problem. Are you making any initiatives in other states?
We absolutely are. We have an affiliate program, and we're on our third cohort this year, where we found we're working with a donor who allows us to put out an RFP to organizations around the country that are working with marginalized gender expansive youth, girls particularly. And so we're able to really, they license our curriculum, they come to our training, they use all of it, we give them access to all of our curricula and our training materials so they can go and work in their own communities. And it's been so powerful. So Flint, Michigan, and Texas correctional facilities, and the Nolly Jenkins Family Center in Mississippi, and they call it sketches and stretches. So it's sort of like taking what we're doing and making it work for their community and making it culturally responsive. And so really helping them to make it work for their own community. So we have 26 affiliates around the country now, and it's been a great way to spread what we do. And we want to keep doing it because we're subject matter experts now. We want it to be happening more, but we have a limited capacity here in our 3 counties. We believe to, instead of spreading our own service providers out wide, we want to work with each youth more deeply in terms of when they're incarcerated, when they get out, and ideally in terms of the bigger vision, how to help them have a pipeline, a pathway to become yoga teachers with us. That kind of, to make them feel more welcome in wellness careers as a whole. And our current mentoring program is really focused on that right now.
Yeah, let's touch on that. You mentioned it, and it seems like, the art of yoga is it's a holistic program, but you call them moginis, these mentors.
We did. One of the judges called them that. That has not stuck. I mean, we called them that we mentored a long time ago as part of more of a probation model. And it was really powerful. Girls would go AWOL and they'd call their mentor, and we'd have to work with them. I mean, it's so great, but it was incredibly time and resource intensive. And we were then getting much more demand for our classes. So we moved more back into classes. And then with COVID, we have embraced our mentoring again. And it's different this time because we're working really closely with a very special organization called the Young Women's Freedom Center. And they are really folks with lived experience. They're taking youth that are formerly incarcerated, involved in the underground street economy, youth, and they're really have an empowerment model. So they are all about bringing them into leadership. So now our mentors, which we call mindful mentors in this new program, are matched based on, our goals are really kind of threefold. It's sort of help them to use these tools for self-care and to heal their trauma, integrating that practice into their own lives, using these tools in their own leadership. Because the Young Women's Freedom Center are cultivating leaders and activists. And we're helping them with that to give them tools. Leaders need self-care. They need tools of regulation. So we're framing it in that way. And then the third thing is we've learned from them that BIPOC youth, Black and brown girls, don't necessarily feel comfortable in the wellness fields or feel welcome. And so we want to change that, particularly in the yoga service world. So, but what does it take? It takes that one-on-one, profound, deep, what is your life like? Walking alongside somebody. What are your barriers? And I'm telling you, it's unbelievable what the layers of trauma. It's relentless. I mean, it's just, I can't even explain how difficult it is for some of these youth. And so to have one person there with them to help them. And then our goal is to, at the end of a year mentorship, have a concrete step toward the interest area, whether it's an internship with a physical therapist, or a yoga teacher training program that we sponsor and help them, or whatever they'd like to do. One of our mentors right now just signed on for a film academy. So our mentor found out that the mentee was really interested in film, and especially in the social justice field. And again, so it's not just yoga, it's creative expression for us and careers in that. And then our mentor found this academy, this internship that just came up. The mentee applied for it, got it, started it yesterday. So it's so awesome. I think people need that kind of one-on-one care right now, especially with what's been happening in our country or around the world, really.
You call it the Art of Yoga Project. Hearing you, Mary Lynn, I would call it the heart. But you mentioned a probation officer, and I want to read a quote that I actually dug up and found from a probation counselor.
Okay.
He said, it relieves their stress, it centers them, gives them an inner peace. It gives them an opportunity to think outside the box. They become more aware of others. They're not the center of the universe anymore. They learn by watching in yoga that everyone struggles just like them.
Yeah, it's really cool to see in the juvenile settings. They would allow us to take youth that had to be separated in classrooms and residentially because of really deep gang ties, which I'm just going to say are lifelines for these youth. You know, it's ultimately a very difficult and destructive thing, but it's really brings community for these youth. So it's important to them. So we have to have kind of a respect, but also kind of slowly work with them on it. Anyway, so the probation would separate them, but we were able to have them all together in our yoga classes. And that's really powerful. And we knew that how important that was. And so we really, in our discussions, you could just see these youth that thought that they were so different. And then when we would ask them these check-in questions or checkouts, and they would be like, that's like me. You know, she's not so different from me. And to see that going on and have them working on a mural of the tree of yoga right next to each other. I mean, these moments, I'll always have them. That kind of unity.
Do you call what you do yoga therapy, yoga service, mind-body practice? How do you sell this?
Again, a lot depends on who, but really mindfulness-based practice is kind of a term that we're using now. Sometimes we're not doing as much asana. We're doing more self-regulating movements, sensory integration, depending on what's needed. But we're definitely proud to call ourselves a yoga service organization. I think yoga service is so important right now. And we all, as any yogi, really, if they're really embracing the path of yoga and what it's meant to be, you know, the full 8 limbs, that we're going to see ourselves as important in taking on that social responsibility of being a yogi. And I guess our advisor, Susanna Barkataki, who I think you probably know, would say yoga is a path of social justice. And if we have to, I think as yogis, we really want to embrace that and see ourselves that way. If someone else is suffering, then I'm suffering. My liberation is bound up in theirs, right? I'm not free if someone else isn't free. And to have that kind of attitude.
I just read Reverend Jagannath's book on the Inside Patanjali Sutras. And at one point he says, there is no yoga without service.
It's true. And we, you know, in the West, we're very individualized, and we've been using yoga for our own health and well-being and attractiveness and all the things we do in the West, but it's really not the spirit of yoga, as you know. And I hope with the Yoga Service Council and Give Back Yoga and the work that all these great organizations that we're all doing, that we can, I see a trend. I see people taking that responsibility and then along with that, I see if you're going to decide to do work and work with marginalized and vulnerable populations, you also need to really go into a deeper self-inquiry. And I see that happening too, everywhere. And that's exciting, especially with anti-racist education. And so it's an exciting time, I think, right now.
I don't want to stop, but I have to.
Oh,
I'm a 200-hour, I'm a 300-hour trained yoga teacher. I want to work with you. How do I contact you? I want to take one of your teacher trainings. How do we reach you?
theartofyogaproject.org. We also have a YouTube site with a whole catalog of practices, trauma-informed yoga, 20 to 30 minutes that we created a library during COVID so that anyone could use them, so you can get really a sense of what we do. There's a wonderful film on there, the neuroscience of yoga and how our approach works that we've just created. You can apply with us at office@theartofyogaproject.org. We have a training coming up on March 6th. That's an online training, the first time we've ever done that. And that's going to be really exciting. March 6th, a Saturday. So registration closes 25th of February. So if you'd like to be part of that, please join. We'd love to have you.
Mary Lynn, I can't thank you enough. And it's been such a joy to share this time with you. And I think it's just been a great initiative that you've taken on for your life work, and I honor that. So thank you so much.
I feel that, and I really appreciate being here, being able to talk with you. Thank you so much for what you're doing.
There are more of these coming up, everyone, on Give Back Yoga University, free interviews and also classes. And the next few months, there will be a focus on long COVID and addressing the symptoms of people who are facing recovery from COVID. So thank you all for joining. Thank you, Mary Lynn, and have a good day, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.